Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Research Network video series. In this series, we explore research from a relational perspective. We hear from people working with a relational research process and learn about related values, concepts, and practices. To start, here are some of our ideas. Research from a relational perspective embodies a philosophical and co-creative stance. It is thus not a method, per se, but rather a collaborative way of being. Engaging from this perspective entails an ethical responsiveness to a focus of inquiry. Recognizing that reality is created through language and social structures means it can also be recreated. Relational research is a process that is attentive to broader relations and interactions. The purpose is to expand possibilities and co-create transformative potentials. We hope you enjoy the series and invite you to join in the conversation. Kristin Bodiford and Celiane Camargo-Borges, a conversation. Celiane Camargo-Borges is a faculty at Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands and a board member of the Taos Institute. In their exploration of relational research, Celiane and Kristin embrace research as a social practice, where the design and the methods are relationally and contextually defined. They also emphasize the role of the researcher as an instrument, by the choices made throughout the process, emphasizing a position of power with, paying explicit attention to whose voices are included, heard, excluded, or silenced.
Celiane, thank you so much for joining this conversation with the Taos Relational Research Network, exploring concepts of relational research and what engaging in research from a relational orientation means to us. And we've been having this conversation for many years, so I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be talking with you, and also an enjoyment to expand our conversations on relational forms of research. So thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, so I'm curious, where would you like to start?
Well, I would like to start our conversation with the assumption that all research is relational. We have different traditional formats of research that will lead into understanding knowledge production methodologies in different ways. But I think it's important for us to invite this approach that independently of the research tradition, all research is relational.
Thank you so much for starting with this assumption that we're going to be using for this conversation, that we might consider all forms of research to be relational. And from there, we can then explore differences. Can you share with me how you start from that space, from that place, that assumption?
Yeah, sure. So if we embrace this assumption that all research is relational, and also the assumption or the concept that Sheila McNamee brings to us of research worlds. So we have many different research worlds that hold different ways and traditions of doing research. When we are talking about the format that the relational research approach takes, I would say that we take the radical position of embracing the relationality and use that in the research formats. So for example, as a researcher, instead of having the position of the research trying to be neutral and objective, then we embrace the position if we are working with relationality. So let's open and try to see how, as a researcher, I'm also involved in the research by the values I have, by the questions I ask, by my expertise, and how can I be more conscious about that, but how can I be more transparent and explicit when I'm designing a research and including that in my research project, for example.
So Celiane, you often talk about research as a way of producing knowledge. And if we, again, assume all research is relational and it's just different ways of producing knowledge, communicating and relating, can you build on that a little bit more, potentially looking at the approach to research, the epistemology that we embrace from a constructionist orientation. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I was just sharing about, as a researcher, how you go into what some authors call research as an instrument. So you become also part of the research. You are not completely separate from the research. And then from there, when you are designing your methodology, for example, you, in some tradition, in some research traditions, you might go into hypothesis testing. With the constructionist research, we can also think about having some assumptions for the research, but being more flexible with the process of doing research, understanding that in the interaction we are having throughout the research, new ideas might emerge or new possibilities that you can embrace, and then new propositions might emerge. Something very important here is they are pretty much focused on being useful and generative, instead of just being focused on finding the final results or being too faithful to your initial research question. So you want to be useful. And this concept of bricolage that comes from anthropology is the idea that you can take some pieces and bits of methods and tools that can help you in creating a full picture. And then this full picture happens in the process.
One thing that transformed for me when thinking about research from a constructionist orientation and the ideas that you're bringing in, it's that it expands how we can all engage in research and how meaningful it can be. And I also think that it leads to us thinking about that reflexive position throughout, as you're talking about thinking about what's useful. So as we're engaging in the research process with our co-researchers, having a place of being reflexive along the way to determine what's most useful towards the sort of change and possibilities that we're working towards. There's two things to build on that a little bit. One is we've talked about the actionality of knowledge, that research is not just about producing knowledge, but what's the change that we're hoping to see in the world. And the second is who decides? You know, we've talked a lot about this as we are collaborating with communities and organizations that we're working with and students, that how are we all making decisions together? Yeah. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm so glad you are bringing up these concepts. They are fundamental in relational research, reflexivity. You cannot engage in relational research without having this process of self-reflexivity, but also community reflexivity, to make sure the steps we are taking make sense and are connected to your topic, but also to the people, to the participants of the research. And actionality is also pretty much related to producing knowledge that can have an impact in the system. So it's not just for the sake of having new knowledge, but is this new knowledge useful, generative, and to whom? Which is your also what you're calling the attention. To whom is this useful? And who is counting in this research, and which voices can be heard and which voices might be hidden and silenced. And it's, I would say it's very important that your participants are, which sometimes, especially in action research, they are called co-researchers, in the sense that they are actively involved in the process and they have the voice to bring throughout the process their own perceptions and their own ideas about the research. And I think constructionist research, they are always attentive to this process of doing research with people and not for people.
Well, as you say that, Celiane, the shift of research with versus research for reminds me of something that we both hold very dear in terms of a framework that we use in engaging in research using design thinking or design approaches that allows us to move through research projects where everyone can bring expertise to create something useful, a product, a service, or a change in the system. Can you share a little bit about that and how you think of design thinking as a useful approach when we think about constructionist ways of engaging in research?
I love this question, and I love exchanging ideas with you in this combination of design-oriented approaches with research. And in design thinking, you will pretty much have some principles that can be so connected to relational research. One of them is all the projects are human-centered. They're context-related. And these principles invite us to pay attention at who are the people we are working with and what is the context and what this context needs. And the tools, design thinking, they have a collection of creative tools that contributes to the process of engaging people together, to talk, to tell stories, to innovate on a topic. And in that sense, it pretty much matches with the idea in relational research that you are not really collecting data, but you are all the time generating data. So there is no such thing as a data ready, waiting for you to collect. But as we engage with our participants, we are generating new ideas. So design thinking can help us engage in a more creative, innovative ways. And also, I would say arts-based research, so borrowing from the arts, some tools that can also help participants to think and to talk about a topic in less rational ways. Sometimes in rational ways, people already know what they want to answer. And then when you bring more creative ways, you enact new possibilities and imaginations in the research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I love learning about how to bring design thinking more into the research process and the opportunities that are expanded because of this. You mentioned before this concept of that really all research enacts our values. That we really, as researchers, are not able to separate our own values and beliefs. And I think that plays a really important role in how we're thinking about research from a constructionist perspective. And I wanted to draw attention to Ken's paper on research's future forming. This proposal of pragmatic idealism relies on us all bringing our values into the research to generate positive changes in the world. What are some of the conditions, like if you were to say, these are the conditions that really are useful for me as I'm engaging in research to enable constructive knowledge and change?
So I'm glad you brought the concept of future forming research, Kristin, that invite us to think of research as creating new possibilities. And this invitation also makes me think about the conditions you asked me, and I'm thinking right now of 3 conditions. We talked already about some of them in this conversation, but I would think of who you are as a researcher. How can you recognize the values you are bringing in? How can you think of how invested you are? How are you framing your research? How you want to interact with your participants? So all these elements play a very important role when you start a research, the process of the research, and even how you are engaging with your methodology. So in relational research, this relationality with yourself is also very fundamental. And then there are some relational principles of research. And here I'm going to do a little marketing of our paper. where we published about designing research, and we talk about some principles that can guide researchers when they are focusing on this process of doing research with people, which is being very relational and collaborative, useful and generative, engaging the complexity of the research, and also being organic and dynamic. So I think we can share this paper with our audience and invite them to dive more into these principles and how can you embrace that throughout the process of the research. And finally, of course, the tools, your tools to actively work with people and data. It's very important. And I would say creative methods for data generation is something you might want to look into it. Design thinking can offer many creative tools, arts-based research, and this combination, who you are as a researcher, the more philosophical principles you want to embrace, and creative tools, I think that can make a great relational research.
Perfect. Thank you. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, you mentioned in there too about how we are thinking about the methods, the methodology and methods, and the way that we engage in research. And that's been a big conversation in the Relational Research Network, that one methodology or one method or approach is not relational or not relational, but rather thinking of what is useful to creating the change that we're hoping to see in the world. And we can link to our paper for people to access, because I continue to find the principles very useful. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'd like to make an invitation. We both believe in enlarging conversations. So people can below in the YouTube discussion, share your thoughts and ideas. We've also talked about a couple different conversations that we think might be really interesting and useful moving forward. And one is, maybe a conversation engaging with others who are teaching research from a constructionist perspective. What are the approaches that they're using to help students to learn about research from a constructionist perspective? Conversations with students that have been learning about research from a constructionist perspective and engaging in research, and how is that transforming how they're thinking of themselves as researchers and how they engage in research. And I think the third is learning how to engage in research to make a better world. What are we learning that's essential? So I'm excited about continuing the conversations. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or conclude with?
No, I think we had a great conversation, and always nice talking to you, and always a pleasure to explore this topic and to engage with relational research. So thank you for having me here today, Kristin.
Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you to Kristin Bodiford and Celiane Camargo-Borges. More about Celiane at www.tausinstitute.net/Celiane-Camargo-Borges. Please join in the conversation. What captured your attention in this video? How do you think these ideas reflect a relational orientation to research? Please leave a comment on this YouTube page or join our community at www.tausinstitute.net/relational-research-network. There you can find a lot more information and resources. We thank the Relational Research Network leadership team for the vision and dedication to making this video series come to life.